Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar presented by Validation Institute, Using Technology and Data to Reduce COVID-19 Transmission and Other Enduring Risks and Anxiety in the Conference, Hospitality, Travel, Entertainment, and Related Industries. Now, before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to go over a few housekeeping items. If you're having any problems viewing the webinar or encounter any technical difficulties, please use your chat box to send a question directly to me, the host, and we'll try to help you. Second, I'd like to explain how we're handling questions. Due to the number of attendees, participant lines are muted. If you'd like to submit a question for our presenters, please do so using the question box on the right side of your screen. Please submit your questions to all panelists. We'll be monitoring the questions for anything urgent, but we really want to respect everyone's time and try to keep this webinar within the allotted time frame. We'll answer all those we have time to address during the program. Otherwise, we'll contact you offline. Please do feel free to contact our presenters with any additional questions, and please note that this webinar will be recorded. You'll receive an email with a link to the video so that we can view it, so you can view it again. And I'll now turn it over to Vidar Jurgensen to get us started on today's webinar.
Welcome. I'm Vidar Jurgensen, Chairman of the Validation Institute, and our mission is to bring price and outcomes transparency to healthcare and other industries that affect health of our population. The COVID-19 crisis that we're in right now is so fast moving that we're going to focus first on where we are today, where we would like to get to in 12 months, and then where we would like to try to get to in the next 2 years or so. We believe that by using data, technology, and science, we can reduce the anxiety and reduce the transmission of the disease. And the mission of this conference call, is to help move us in that direction. I'm now going to introduce Al Lewis, who is co-founder of the Validation Institute and also founder of Quizify, which takes learnings from conferences like this and puts them in a questionnaire format that employers can provide to their employees. Al, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lipkin. Dr. Ian Lipkin has graciously agreed to spend most of the next hour answering our questions, of which there are many, about novel coronavirus. You may have, many have been submitted in advance, and you may be able to use the chat box to ask others. By way of background, Ian is the John Snow Professor of Epidemiology, Professor of Neurology and Pathology and Cell Biology at Columbia University, where he is also Director of the Center for Infection and Immunity. Now, I've been following his career for many years, so I can tell you a few things he may be too modest to mention. He's made multiple trips to China both before and after the outbreak, and had long ago advised them to shut down their wild animal markets to avoid exactly this risk. Those of you who saw the movie Contagion, which contains some eerie similarities to the current outbreak, will not be surprised to learn that he was the consulting epidemiologist for that movie. Most impressively, within the last few days, he's been featured on both Lou Dobbs and Rachel Maddow. Now, that's rare enough on its own, but rarer still is the fact that neither of them hollered at him. Now, I'm listed as co-presenter here, but I will be turning my time slot over to Ian because he's the guy you came to hear. And while I'm often not the smartest guy in the room, it's rather depressing not to be the smartest guy in the room when there are only 2 people in the room, and yet when I'm with Ian, that's what happened. As Quizmeister and Chief of Quizify, though, as Vidar mentioned, I will be adapting this material to fit our series of employee-focused Corona literacy quizzes and making them available to attendees within a couple of days. Once Ian is wrapped, Tommy Anolis will wrap up with some specific advice for food safety and operational execution in the restaurant industry, and now I will turn this over to Vidar to moderate.
Well, we'll turn it right over to Ian for his presentation, and then we have a growing list of questions. Ian, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the invitation. By way of full disclosure, Al is my brother-in-law, and when his sister and my wife are in the room, neither of us is the smartest one in the room. So with that preamble, let me go into it. This virus, which originally came from a bat and moved into humans, has probably been circulating in the human population since the latter part of 2019. It first came to my attention on December 15th when I received a call from a colleague at Sun Yat-sen University who suggested that there was a new pneumonia that was circulating in Wuhan. I reached out to him to try to help with characterization of the virus, and he said that he was doing fine, and then on the 31st called and told me that he'd identified the virus, but that it was not particularly transmissible, so there was really nothing to worry about. And then, as you all know, it's evolved in what it is today, and it is by far the most remarkable health threat that I've encountered, certainly in my career, and probably since the 1918 flu pandemic. You will read a lot from various people who are making, various estimates as to what the final death count will be. Some people are projecting millions will die. Other people are projecting that it will be in the neighborhood of tens of thousands, and the answer is we really don't know. And it's a function really of whether or not we do or don't respond in a coherent fashion. Much of my work for the past several days has been in trying to persuade various people who are at the national, state, and local levels to isolate people more vigorously and to move us toward the sort of lockdown that we now have in the Bay Area on the West Coast and that was so effective in China. I was in China in January, came back the 4th of February, and I can tell you that the most important intervention there was isolation. There was no drug, there was no vaccine. There was an effort to try to force everybody to stay in-house. The other thing that was extremely important was that they established hospital facilities, and they moved in everyone who was infected. This allowed them to have those people who were not yet infected, who were family members of those who were infected, to stay in-house. Some of them didn't convert. The ones who were placed into these hospitals did, and this took the transmission rate down from 1 to 3 down to 1 to 0.3. So it reduced it dramatically by a factor of an order of magnitude. And this is what brought this pandemic under control. The virus is a coronavirus. It simply refers to the morphology and electron microscopy. These are highly transmissible viruses. For many, many years, the coronaviruses were studied as models for human central nervous system diseases. People then began to appreciate their role in respiratory disease. Then we had our first major outbreak, which was in 2003, which was the Sars, first one of these beta coronaviruses. Then we had MERS. MERS came from Saudi Arabia. It had a much higher mortality rate than either SARS or this new SARS-CoV-2. And then we have SARS-CoV-2. Nobody really knows the mortality rate yet of SARS-CoV-2 because we don't know the denominator. All we know are the number of people who do die, and we have some sense of the number of people who present and are diagnosed with disease. But even that is likely to be incomplete. If forced to guess, I would think that the mortality rate is somewhere between what we see with flu and what we see with SARS, which means that the majority of the deaths that we see are not because this virus is capable of causing some more disease in an individual, but rather that so many people are infected. The chances are very good that as much as a third of the world's population will become infected. The other thing I want to say is that this virus is going to be with us for a long time to come. And until we have a vaccine, we will continue to see pockets of this virus appearing from reservoirs around the world. At present, it's on every continent with the exception of Antarctica. And I think that's fine for an intro, and then we can move into questions.
Well, I'll start with some of the first questions that came in. Was there anything from your recent trip to China that surprised you that hasn't been reported widely?
Well, I referenced one of the things that was surprising, and that was how long we knew about this and how wrong we were assessing its pathogenic potential. It was not thought to be a major cause of human disease, and it was not thought to be particularly transmissible. We now know that that's not the case. The other thing I would say that's unusual, though not for me, but other people may not be aware of this, is that the infrastructure now for control of infectious diseases is really second to none. They have excellent facilities, a very strong CDC, and they have been transparent. And when people say to me, you know, they're not, I say, well, if they weren't being transparent, they wouldn't tell you their death rates. So it is, it's very different than it was in 2003, where we didn't learn about this virus for several months until after it first begun to cause damage.
I heard on National Public Radio this morning that yesterday China reported just one additional confirmed case. Does that sound credible to you? And do you think there's the potential of a recurrence through community spread in China?
So I'm sure if they told you there was one confirmed case, that is the only confirmed case they have. That doesn't mean that they only have one case. So unless you test, unless you see the patient, you don't know there's another case. But it seems unlikely to me that they would have only one case. Their borders like ours are porous.
Now, the same article, again, the same broadcast for National Public Radio, reported that Volkswagen was able to restart all but 2 of its factories in China. Do you feel that China is getting back to normal in terms of, at least in terms of manufacturing?
I think they are returning toward normal. I know that several commercial facilities are opening and shops are opening, but they took a very, very hard tack. They pushed hard to shut down everything. They shut down Guangzhou, Beijing, as well as Wuhan and Shanghai. And one of the things that I've been trying to emphasize here in the United States is that we will ultimately have to do something similar. The faster we move to that particular position, the sooner we'll be out and the more effective we'll be. It's much easier to leverage the power of the national government if you do it when the problem is small. Had we done so, for example, in the state of Washington at an earlier time point, I think we might have been better off. And I think that Trump's decision, for example, to close borders to some extent was very, very useful. I'm not referring to what's proposed at the southern border. I'm talking about infectious disease control, where you limit people coming in from other areas. I think that it should have extended to all of Europe, not just to the continent. And I'm pushing very, very hard right now to get some sort of a national policy by which we would get everybody to shelter in place.
So is that the biggest step, getting everyone to shelter in place, and are there additional steps that you think we should take right away at the federal level?
At present, all we have is shelter in place. We don't have an approved drug. We can talk about various interventional strategies. We won't have a vaccine for another probably 16 to 18 months. So the only thing we really have at present is isolation. And for that to be effective, it has to be aggressive.
And what do you think the odds are of actually having a successful vaccine within 18 months? Do you see any particular barriers, or do you think it's just that is what's required to?
I don't see any obstacles to making a vaccine. This is not like influenza or HIV, where we have a rapidly evolving target that we need to continually revise, the weapon to address. What we have here is a fairly simple virus. We know what it looks like. We understand its structure. We can make antibodies to it and neutralize it. So it's a question really of going through safety testing and efficacy testing. And this is a process that, really cannot be shortcut, because sometimes we have adverse events when we build no vaccine. So we have a regular algorithm that we employ for taking things through to approval.
And are there things that do you think this shelter in place has to be done at the federal level? And until that happens, are there any states that you think have set a better example than others in terms of taking the lead?
California is the first one to behave in a way that I really think is rational. I live in the state of New York. It's been very difficult to persuade the mayor and the governor to close the schools. We finally have done this. The challenge, of course, is that if you have young people who now have no place to go, then they wind up, they may get into difficulties, they may get into trouble. Some of these people require the school system to provide breakfast and lunch, so they lose their nutrition. And it's a politically very difficult position for a politician to adopt. That said, these are unusual times, and this is what we need to do. If it's mandated at the federal level, we'll have a much better, likelihood of actually getting this thing under control. If New Jersey and Connecticut have different approaches than New York, it's going to be tough. So what we really need to do is to, as was done in China, tell people that they have to remain indoors. For those people who are engaged in essential services like providing utilities, food, maintaining telecommunications, those individuals need to do whatever it is they need to do outside of the confines of their homes, but everyone else needs to stay indoors. And in the event that you run out of food or some other provision, you select one person to go out and represent the group. That's still short of what the Chinese did. The Chinese actually went in, identified people who were sick, and removed them to these hospitals. These hospitals were not quite so much focused on providing care as they were as providing containment.
And are there other countries that you would rank as next to China in their response, including, say, countries like Singapore, South Korea?
Well, Singapore is an unusual example. I mean, Singapore is a country, yes, but basically it's one large city. So it's much easier to do something in Singapore than it is to do it in a country the size of China or the United States. They engage in very active surveillance using testing. This is not something that we can do as easily as they could. So I think this is what we've got, and I think testing is something that we will continue to emphasize. But the intervention that's going to make a difference is going to be the isolation.
And what should business leaders do now, and then what should they do to create a situation where we get back to something resembling normal sooner rather than later?
This is not anything that I really understand. I feel for you all and the people, obviously, who work for you, these businesses, but I don't know what to do with respect to businesses.
Okay. And if the federal government were to follow your recommendations of a very strict shelter-in-place policy and enforce that, what difference would that make in terms of the range of time it would take to get back to something that resembled normal economic production?
So the way I would look at that would be to say the following. We have a mean incubation period of 5 to 7 days. And if we take it out, say 3 generations, I would say, but this requires very focused, rigorous investment in this policy. If you take it out 3 generations, or perhaps 4 if you're outside, that would be 28 days. So you would cut the chain of transmission, you reduce the R0, for the first group, and then you reduce it again and again and again. With each subsequent iteration of 5 to 7 days, you would have a dramatic reduction. And I think we would get down to that R0 of 0.3, which is when things burn out. The R0 is the number of people who become infected by a given individual. You want to get it well under 1 because that means that there is nothing to sustain it. But when it's 3, then every single cycle you get 3 people, then 9. It goes on bigger and bigger and bigger. So I think if we invest in, as a country, in the social distancing in a very extreme way, we can get this under control in a month. But that means we have to commit to that. If we do something which is half-hearted, we're not going to achieve that. Maybe we'll get down to an R0 of 1.5, but you need to get well under 1 to burn out this particular pandemic.
Are there other countries that are getting to well under 1?
No. Nobody's done this really except China, using this kind of social distancing approach. And there's a lot of, you can see what's happened in Italy, and it's happening in Spain and so forth. People are resistant to the social distancing because what happens is you don't really see just how bad it is, because you're percolating along with a few cases, say, oh, we've only got 100 cases, but suddenly the next day it's 200 cases. And because you've got these groups that are incubating, the day after that it's 400, the day after that it's 800, and so forth. So by the time you get to the end of that period of 4 or 5 days, suddenly you have 1,000 cases. And then you begin to overwhelm emergency rooms and people who need to be seen for trauma or for strokes or for heart attacks can't get seen. So this is a huge problem, and it's something that we need to address rigorously and directly. And I think the president made headway yesterday for the first time in acknowledging the extent of the problem, but he didn't go far enough.
And what are the states or areas in the country that are getting closest to overwhelming their local hospital facilities? Any of
the urban centers. I think what we're going to find is that in California, as a result of what's now been done, that although there may be a continued climb in cases, in about a week, 10 days, you'll begin to see it taper off. And then what some people say to me is, we need California to do the experiment to demonstrate to the rest of the country that this is an approach that's viable and productive. And I say, we've already done this experiment in China. We know what it looks like. We should adopt this nationally.
Is there any evidence anywhere that you've seen that the virus is mutating significantly?
There are people talking about the virus mutating, but that's not going to move the needle. The issue really is this virus is very well adapted to humans, grows quite well, it reproduces itself, and it will continue to do this, and it will continue to cause damage until such time as we bite the bullet and do what needs to be done. If we had a vaccine, it would be different. We could vaccinate everybody, but we don't, and we won't for several months. So we are right now at a tipping point where either we're going to address this coherently or we're going to slide off the edge.
Are there any additional things to sheltering in place that the federal government should do, like speeding up the availability of testing? I read that the tests would be available in 2,000 facilities. Well, why not all 6,000 hospitals and all of LabCorp and Quest? Is there any?
Testing is important. It's not as important as it was a while ago when we really needed it. When you had very sparse, examples of clusters, you could test people who came into contact with those individuals and you could say these people need to be isolated. But now this thing is everywhere. So even with testing, although I'm not discouraging testing, I actually spend much of my career now still building tests. I think it's beyond the point where testing is gonna be the big cure for this. What we need to do is isolation. We need sheltering in place. And it's nothing that anybody wants to hear. But that's the bitter medicine we have to swallow. If we had tested earlier, I think we wouldn't be in this position.
And what can we do over the next 12 months beyond sheltering in place to make sure that it is less likely to come back, or at least we're in a better position to deal with the virus if it returns on a seasonal basis? What needs to be in place
so if the virus,
manage that?
Right. So if the virus comes back under control and the number of cases begins to drop, then testing will again become absolutely paramount. Because every time there's a new cluster of respiratory illness, we'll be able to say this is or is not the novel coronavirus, and we will be able to isolate accordingly. There's a lot of background of other respiratory noise that people don't know about. Rhinoviruses, influenza viruses, other things. Some of these can be treated with specific drugs. We don't have anything yet for this one, but we are trying now to explore the possibility that certain drugs can be repurposed from other uses, such as treatment of HIV, AIDS, or cancer, or other viral infections. And we're also looking at the possibility of immunotherapy, getting antibodies from people who have recovered, and they should have activity against this virus. And there's some preliminary data from China that suggests that that is true.
So there's a lot of fear and anxiety in the public, and we have a lot of people on the webinar today that are in the hospitality, the travel, the food service, the hotel, and the conference business. And they want to be able to lay the groundwork to reduce that anxiety for the long run. What do you think they could be doing now to lay the groundwork? There's not much they can do other than to maybe encourage the shelter-in-place policies, but there is probably something that they should be laying the groundwork for the long run, like in areas of being able to better track disease, maybe for meetings, maybe for hotels. Do you think that once this is more under control, say in a year or so, that meeting facilities should at least have the capacity to restrict people based on their prior travel if the virus is still active in different parts of the world, to keep people from those parts of the world out of their facilities?
I think you can do things of that sort, but the other thing that I find, at least when I travel in Asia, is there's a reassurance when you see that the people who are serving you are wearing gloves, are wearing masks, and that everything is wiped down on a regular basis. And if you assure people that this is the case, and that the remote control in their room and their glasses are sealed and sanitized, all of that is done, they will feel much better about it.
Ian, we have a lot more questions for you, but that comment is a good segue to introduce Tommy Ioannoulis, who is the co-founder of Ops Analytica, which is a platform that restaurants and now other facilities can use to assure food safety. And he's worked in the restaurant business all his life, and he's been running or co-founder of Ops Analytica since 2015. I might add there are other vendors in this area, including Jolt and Zenput. But today he says that his biggest competition is paper tracking. And but he says that he's now getting questions from his customers about how to reduce the transmission of infectious disease. So, Tommy, if you could just give a little 3-minute introduction, that we'll go back to the questions for Ian and you.
Sure. Thank you. And real quick, thank you, Vidar, for having me. I would suggest that what Dr. Lipkin was saying was absolutely true from a business perspective, because right now what we're seeing as well is that all these businesses are at 1/3 of their normal revenue, maybe 1/2 of their revenue. And if we hang out at that level for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then we do a 1-month quarantine at the end of that, they're going to go a much longer period in a much higher reduced revenue thing, and it's going to crush a lot of these businesses. So I would agree with him 100% obviously on everything he's an expert in, but I'm just saying from a business perspective, I think it's better for the entire country that we quarantine immediately so we can get out of this and get back to work sooner. So what our platform does is we have a food safety and ops execution platform, and we make it very easy for big multi-unit location chains, hotels, restaurants to manage their response, change behavior at the location level, and ensure that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing from a sanitation, food safety, and daily operations perspective. And we have clients right now that are addressing COVID-19 across their entire multinational chains, and we're helping facilitate that for them and making it very easy to do, because they can simply publish a new directive or publish a new checklist, and then they can literally drive the behavior at that location level. As an example, we have a dine-in chain, and they're in the process of pulling everything off their tables right now. Ketchup, salt, pepper, sugar, all that stuff's getting pulled off the tables to facilitate cleaning, but also to reduce the risk of somebody coughing on one of those things and then spreading the disease in their own buildings. So I guess just to kind of like sum up my very quick 3-minute block, I would say that using technology to help manage this process within your locations is absolutely doable. And with a system like ours, you can literally drive behavior change at the location level at the click of a button.
Tommy, do you have any evidence to prove that moving from paper to technology and being able to aggregate data from multiple restaurants in one place makes any difference in terms of being able to pass the various inspections? You know, does it reduce inspection failures? Does it really reduce the number of infections that or are problems that the restaurant customers have? Can you really document and measure the results?
Absolutely. What we have a big problem in the hospitality industry, and I would suggest in a lot of different industries where we use paper checklists as the main way of managing stuff, is a problem called pencil whipping. And pencil whipping is just filling something out to get it done, but not actually doing it. And with technology, we provide visibility and accountability in the background. And so we can now at least see if somebody's pencil whipping, and then we can follow up with them and get them to redo it. And then as we add more and more technology into that, we can get better and better readings, such as using a Bluetooth thermometer versus a normal thermometer. We now know that we're getting a real temperature. So absolutely. And our clients, when they implement our system, they all of a sudden realize, wait, I didn't realize how bad the paper system was, because they start to see all the inconsistencies and they're like, whoa, now we see real data versus what we used to get, which was pencil whip data. They can start comparing and they start to realize how bad the problem was before.
And Tommy, can your platform be adopted for hotels, hospitals, and other facilities?
Absolutely. We're vertical agnostic. We focus on the restaurant industry because we're restaurant guys, but our platform can be, it's self-service and easily customizable to be, it's just a way to collect human data on a tablet or a phone, and then apply logic to that data and do all that stuff. So yes, absolutely.
Okay. Ian, I'm going to go back to you now. We're getting more questions for you. From a large employer perspective, what are the best and most reliable online sources for current data? Would it be the CDC or are there other sources? Where should employers turn to for reliable data?
I think the best source is the World Health Organization. The CDC is another site that I think is very good. New York Times has very interesting editorials and modeling, so I use them. I use all three. I personally read every day the Wall Street Journal, the Times, and the Washington Post, but I don't think people need to do that necessarily. World Health Organization's fine. I think they've been a bit behind in recommending, the sort of very aggressive stance that I'm proposing, which is, there may have been political reasons for that. The CDC is, they're trying to do the best they can. They've been underfunded, which has been a problem, and as you know, led to difficulties with the testing. But they're a good source as well.
Okay, and then for the longer term, what does this country need to sort of put in place so that we're not blindsided or less likely to be blindsided again? You'd mentioned the vaccine, of course. You'd mentioned better monitoring and in testing. What should we put in place today so that we are less likely to find ourselves in this situation in 2 or 3 years?
Well, there are two aspects of that question that I would want to address. One is this particular agent, and the associated disease, COVID-19, and the other is other things that are coming that will follow and could cause similar damage. Starting with COVID-19, we need to ensure that when vaccines are developed, that people take them, because we can't force people to take them, at least currently. And unless we get a certain amount of coverage, we're not going to get that sort of herd that sort of surrounds people who haven't been vaccinated, so that we'll still have recurrent episodes of release of this virus. It is not going away. There will be reservoirs in humans that will periodically appear. So important to emphasize that vaccination must be done once it becomes available. With respect to other agents that come up, there have been efforts to try to identify chatter, the human-animal interface, emerging infections, particularly in areas where people consume wild animals for protein or take them as pets. And until this process ends, we will continue to have new, more exotic, more challenging infectious agents emerge. Several years ago, there was a program called the National Biosurveillance Advisory Subcommittee. I was a member of that group for a while, and then I became co-chair of that group. And we made a series of substantive recommendations to both the Obama and Bush administrations. Some of the recommendations were followed, some were not. But one of the strongest ones was that capacity building in the developing world is critical, because if you can stop something when it's still localized, it's much easier to do this and to have a good result than if you wait until it is amplified and it's come to our shores. So we need to invest in surveillance and infectious disease response overseas.
What country does the best in encouraging their population to be vaccinated? And what additional steps would you take there? What should our goal be in terms of vaccination?
I think, for example, with measles, mumps, rubella, we should have 100% coverage except for those rare individuals who cannot be vaccinated with a live vaccine. Similarly, there are some killed vaccines, but are nonetheless very important. Diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, also extremely important. The papillomavirus vaccine that will prevent both oropharyngeal as well as cervical cancers. Hepatitis B vaccine, hepatitis C vaccine when we have it, and I think we may have a hepatitis C vaccine in the not too distant future. and there is nothing that compares with vaccines in terms of bang for the buck.
And are there any countries that do a gold standard job of encouraging?
The Scandinavian countries tend to be better, I think, than most of the others.
Okay. And then, you know, we now have a lot more data. We have a lot more research capabilities. Do you think that we're much better at dealing with challenges like the COVID-19 situation than, say, back in the days of the Spanish flu and even SARS and MERS?
Well, with respect to SARS, it took a week and a large set of sequencers and a whole team of people to identify that infectious agent. The agent responsible for COVID-19, which is SARS coronavirus type 2, took, you know, a couple of days and a single investigator. So I think that this is an example of the way that technology has provided us with tools that are useful. That said, we don't have still great, you know, advances in vaccine that allow us to skip safety steps. There are some things that we simply need to do step by step. And even if we find drugs, for example, that are effective in tissue culture, even in fact, and may work in fact in experimental animals, you still have to go through very rigorous testing. So that portion hasn't moved as rapidly as we might like. The distribution of technologies for pathogen identification and diagnostics is still incomplete across the world. The International Health Regulations of 2005 stated that every country had to be able to diagnose diseases within its own borders and share those data transparently. We're still not there.
Okay. Al Lewis and Tommy, do either of you have any particular questions that you would like to ask that have come up? Otherwise, I've got plenty more here, but I just wanted to hear from you too.
Well, some have come in on the chat box. Are antibody tests available yet for at least the narrow segment of people who might be in the vaccine test group, and will they someday be available more broadly?
So the antibody tests are less well developed than the molecular tests for two reasons. One, they're not as urgent. The primary reason to have the antibody tests is to get an accurate case mortality rate, because we don't really know how many people have been infected, so it gives you an estimate of burden. And as well as trying to identify people who have been exposed and are immune, who might be good candidates for serving as first responders. And the people who don't therefore need to be vaccinated either, because they're already immune. We're also hoping that we will identify some of these survivors who have high titers of antibodies who can serve as donors for protection of people who are either exposed and at high risk or who actually have signs of disease already.
I have a question for Dr. Lipkin. So the CDC is telling the restaurants to basically treat this sort of like norovirus. Would you agree with that? And is there anything, minus obviously quarantining, that the restaurant should be doing in addition to treating it like norovirus, or what should they be doing? Because they
So norovirus is a gastrointestinal virus rather than a respiratory virus, but the parallel, I think, is a good one. They're both highly infectious, and they both have the capacity to persist on surfaces for long periods of time. So I think that's a very realistic and reasonable way to think about it, even though, as I say, they affect different organ systems.
Do you think taking employees' temperatures and then obviously asking them a couple of questions before they come into their shift, would you recommend that, or do you think that's useless?
Well, 88% of people who have symptoms associated with infection have fever. So you will capture some people with fever who might have escaped screening either because they wanted to work anyway or because they simply didn't know. But it's not a perfect situation because people who shed virus before they become symptomatic, and then there are people who run temperatures that are lower than other people, and there are people who take drugs that suppress fever because they want to work. So it's not going to catch everybody.
I think I'll end with my last question, and I'll go quick. Do you think that the restaurant employees should be wearing masks?
I feel more comfortable when they do.
Okay.
So just to pick up on the fever suppression question, one question that came in is, why is the French government and some others advising against using Advil or ibuprofen if one has the virus, and do you agree with that?
Well, there are a couple of different ways of looking at that. Some people think that suppression of certain pathways may actually allow the virus to replicate more than it would otherwise do. So they think that it's potentially harmful. Other people simply don't want you to mask symptoms. So there are different aspects to it. I think the latter is more of a problem than the former. That is to say, hiding the symptoms is more of a problem. So, for example, particularly in airports, right, where people try to get on a plane, they're febrile, they would otherwise be febrile, and they would not be allowed to board.
So one other, and then actually, Vita, I'll pass it back to you because you've got a bunch, and then I'll come back in.
Okay. And Ian, do you feel that once we sort of get, hopefully in X months, we get back to where there are fewer new cases and things seem to be under control, do you think we should be checking the temperature of people coming in to the U.S., and should that be done at a facility level, like for large conferences and meetings? Should there be, should temperature checks or other checks be with us for quite a long time?
Well, in China, every time you go to a hotel or when you pass through customs, there are these screens. The ones where they have, you know, temperature monitors that are suspended from a height, I don't see how they could possibly be accurate. But the ones where you come very close with an infrared, I think are useful. I don't think we need to do it all the time. Once we get this outbreak under control, it probably won't be necessary.
Okay. And what do you think, if we move aggressively now, what do you think of having being in an even better position than we are today in as short as 18 months or even 12 months, even before we have a vaccine, if we very aggressively enforce the shelter in place?
I think this is our best option. And I think that if we do that, we can rapidly bring things under control in 4 to 6 weeks. But that requires being very aggressive with shelter in place and taking people who are sick and trying to find some way to put them into some other facility so that we can bring that R0 down to 0.3 as the Chinese did. Because as long as it's over 1, it's not gonna burn out.
Are we at the stage now where we have the resources, the facilities to isolate those people that need to isolate themselves? Have we passed the capacity to deal with that yet in any areas?
No, we don't. That doesn't mean we couldn't. Cuomo, for example, called for the Army Corps of Engineers to begin to try to retrofit spaces that might be useful for this purpose. We have the old armories. If this country can do anything it wants to do, you know, we've been through a civil war and a revolutionary war and 2 world wars. We can do anything, but we have to work together as a people and make it happen.
So, Vidar, a whole bunch of questions are coming, and we won't be able to get to all of them, but one of them that puzzled me, and it's come in several times, some variation of this, is if on day 0 you are actually infected by coming into contact with someone who's exposed. Number one, when do you start shedding? And number two, when would a test, if it's starting with day 0, when would a test reliably show you as positive?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer, Al, because there are a lot of factors. I would say the earliest that you would begin showing signs in a test would be 2 days. Most people would begin to show signs of a positive test somewhere between day 5 and day 7. Some people claim that you might not see anything for up to 2 weeks, but I think that those particular estimates are first of all, they're anomalous. And in the event that they might be explainable, I would say that somebody wasn't infected early on, and it wasn't a 14-day incubation period, but because the virus is ubiquitous, they saw the virus for the first time at some point that was intermediate between when they thought they received it and when they came down with the disease. So the reasonable way to think of this is perhaps as early as 2 days. Most of the time is 5 to 7 days. And if you don't have symptoms, you may shed virus nonetheless.
Vidar, I think you're seeing the same chat box I'm seeing, so I'll let you pick and choose.
Well, actually, I'm a little limited in what I can see, so
okay.
You keep going. I've got some more questions, though, for him, but you
okay.
get the ones from the chat box.
All right. So given the cautious U.S. approach to isolation, i.e. not what you're saying, what would you suggest for many of these meetings that have been postponed? What's a safe amount to postpone, or is it just not possible to say?
It all depends on what we do.
If we do what we're doing now.
If we do what we're doing now, we could be looking at this well into fall. If we're aggressive about this, we may be able to pull out of this in May. You know, it's a question of what we do, Al. I don't mean to beg the question.
No.
But until we are ultimately going to come down to this, you know, shelter in place. And the longer we wait, the longer the time that we're going to have to do that. So the intelligent approach is just to bite the bullet and do it now.
Well, I'm sheltered in place. Now, the question is, where is the line in shelter in place? Are you allowed to go outside to the park, to a doctor visit, or is it just plain you lay in the food and you stay home for a few weeks?
You're not going to become infected unless you come into contact with somebody who's infected or something that they have been involved with who is infected. So I have conversations like this with people who say, well, I don't come into contact with anybody. I go, but, you know, I just want to go to the gym. And I say, all the gym equipment is contaminated. So you might as well, rub your face against, against somebody else's mouth. It's not going to work. So you have to, you have to understand and think about it. The other thing that I find that's very interesting is people want to play let's make a deal. So they'll call me up and they'll say, is it okay if I do this? And I say no. And they say, well, how about if I don't do this and I do that instead? I said, it's not, you can't bargain with this virus. What you try to do is to minimize the potential for coming into contact with it. And that means that if you go out and you know you're going to be touching something, which is going to be a potential challenge, then you wear gloves, right? So if you decide that you're going to wear a mask, then you put the mask on, and after you put on the mask, you don't then go fidgeting around with your hands after you touch something else. It sort of obviates the whole value to the mask. Most of this is really common sense.
Yes, in our Quizify materials, we advise against masks specifically for that reason, not due to ineffectiveness, but because people are always adjusting them, which of course defeats the purpose.
But you see, in China in 2003, there was a study done by the World Health Organization. Nobody really likes to cite it very much because we have a mask shortage. Nonetheless, the message that came from that was that if you wore masks consistently, 70% rate reduction. Intermittently, 60% rate reduction. And that was Didn't matter whether you use an N95 mask or a surgical mask, which tells you that the major risk is not so much airborne transmission, but what you bring on your hands and touch your face, which you do all the time.
23 times an hour, according to one survey. So while we're on the subject of transmission, if you sneeze, that there's, I guess, a 6-foot radius. Is there the possibility of breathing on somebody, or does it have to be a sneeze or a cough?
Now, I think, the 6 feet, I don't know anybody who can sneeze 6 feet. That sounds like an extraordinarily talented individual. But 3 feet is really sort of more the issue. 6 feet gives you a buffer. But we do know it's not airborne. By airborne, we mean it's not suspended in the air and it doesn't travel great distances. But if somebody sneezes on you, it's a problem. That's fair enough. Or if they sneeze on their hands and then they grab a pole in the subway and you come along and you get unstable on your feet, you will grab that pole and then you go like this, you're off to the races.
Yeah, so of course, one of the things that I'm going to scratch my nose here. One of the things that we teach is that actually these hard, shiny surfaces harbor, the viruses live longer than on soft, cushy surfaces, which is counterintuitive, but I gather that that's accurate.
Why is it counterintuitive?
Because other pathogens, dust mites, bacteria, et cetera, would live longer, for instance, in bedding. I mean, you would open a stranger's door long before you jumped into their bed, unless somebody swiped you right or something.
That's a very strange thing you just said. I'm not sure I want to.
Swiping right is kind of a new thing. You and I don't know about swiping right because we're married. So I had another one here, which is so one of the things that we had recommended that it sounds like is not needed is to turn a humidifier on, because other viruses, such as a flu virus, will not do as well in a reasonably humid environment as in a dry environment, as I understand. But that's not true for coronavirus.
I'm not aware that anybody has studied that in an objective way, so I can't really comment on it. We suggest, when we think about the biology of the virus, that there may be some sort of interference as it gets heavier and as it gets warmer, and this is more ultraviolet light, many other things that I think will be helpful. But at present, from a practical vantage point, the solution for us as a culture and as individuals is to simply remove ourselves, from the transmission path.
Okay, Vidar, with that, I'll turn it over to you for any final questions.
Great. Thank you. So we've got lots of very specific questions still in from the hospitality business in terms of cleaning procedures, training procedures, and so forth that we haven't been able to cover here. So what we will do is we will do another webinar on the 24th at 2, and we will deal with some of these steps that we can take in the hospitality business and to change the way we do things so that the public will feel more secure. And we should take some of the recommendations that Ian said, like the masks, and try to find someone to really research that. But it sounds like the research already exists. And maybe there's a whole new checklist of the use of masks, the use of gloves, cleaning discipline, and so forth that can now be brought into the hospitality business, into hotels, into restaurants, and into the conference business, so that people will feel more confident in going back to larger meetings. So we will answer the questions that have not been answered for everybody, but we would also like new questions that we can cover at a repeat webinar on the 24th at 2 o'clock. And Ian, what I'd like to also do is, if I could, get some sort of a write-up of the research that you're doing, because we would like to bring some more visibility to the research you're doing over the next 10 years or so there at Columbia, so that we are in a better position to deal with these sorts of situations in the future. Ian, Tommy, and Al, I want to thank all of you for participating, and I want to thank everyone who is listening now. And please give us your comments, send us emails or chat saying what we missed, what we should do differently, and how we can improve this. I think we all have the same goal. We want to get to the other side of the river. We want to get past this and put ourselves in a situation where this is less likely to happen again and we're better at dealing with it. But Ian, it was especially an honor to have you participate, and Tommy and Al, we really do appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vidar.
Thank you very much.
Bye now.
Bye, everybody.